Eagle Bluffs is a marvelous conservation area bordering the Missouri River near the city of Columbia. Water is the key to its remarkable diversity of wildlife, and water was at the heart of a political and environmental controversy that occurred nearly 30 years ago. Indeed, without the actions of a small group of citizens at that time, Columbia, like so many other cities along America's rivers, would have had a pipeline directly from its sewage treatment plant to the Missouri River. Instead, treated wastewater is piped to a wetland treatment system, and from there millions of gallons of polished wastewater flows each day to Eagle Bluffs. This is in fact its primary source of water, and without this input, Eagle Bluffs would be a rather ordinary wildlife area. So what about Eagle Bluffs makes it extraordinary? First, the sheer numbers of some species are astounding. Beginning with snow geese and other waterfowl in the winter, tree swallows in the spring, egrets in late summer, and blackbirds in the fall. Then there's the diversity of wildlife. Nearly 300 species of birds alone have been identified at Eagle Bluffs.
I have been working with the Missouri Department of Conservation since 1987. This is one of the top places in the Midwest and in the country too. People come from all over to go to Eagle Bluffs to see lots of different variety of birds, and the ease of having these roads through it, which allows anybody that wants to come here and see things.
So how does the daily input of millions of gallons of treated sewage contribute to Eagle Bluff's success in attracting so much wildlife?
It's really a highly engineered location. It's along a river that's highly engineered, and then the land itself is highly engineered with all the levees and pumps and water control structures. And so we can make these unique habitats, and plus our connectivity with the City of Columbia's wastewater stream. We always have water coming each day to do habitat management. And so the manager and staff can manipulate water levels each day to provide habitats for the suite of species that are either resident or that are just passing through.
The junction box is a really neat part of Eagle Bluffs. So pretty much what I can do is I get city water, the effluent water, coming under the ground in a big pipe. And it comes in pretty much right into here. 95% of the time, if not even more, 99% of the time, I'm dumping the water to the distribution channel, which essentially just all soaks into the ground. I really don't have to let it out of Eagle Bluffs.
So the effluent is normally discharged into the distribution channel here, and I don't see any no fishing signs. So everybody's cool with that?
It's good quality water.
Mm-hmm.
It really is good quality water.
Probably better than what's in the Missouri.
Yeah, if I gave you a mason jar of the effluent versus a mason jar of the Missouri River, you'd be more likely to take a drink out of the effluent. But you probably wouldn't drink either one.
Although key to Eagle Bluff's success, the original plans did not include any input of water from a wetland treatment system. That's because Columbia also had no such plan. Instead, when an ugly fish kill in a local creek in the summer of 1987 revealed the inadequacy of the relatively new sewage treatment plant and resulted in a $17,000 fine by the Environmental Protection Agency, city officials favored the usual solution adopted by cities located near a large river.
Well, the city went back to the people who had just built them a $21 million treatment plant, and that engineering firm said, okay, what we need to do is transfer this water to a bigger body of water, and 5 miles away was the Missouri River, so they said, we will build you a $15.5 million 6-foot diameter pipe to the Missouri River and meet all the standards then by our 13 million gallons a day dumping into the huge river. Be no problem.
Some details about the pipeline proposal became public in November of the next year. But in fact, this proposal was not new.
Get back to your fish kill, I think that probably triggered EPA and DNR and that to get that pipeline built, you know, because it was in the original plan. We'd promised to build a pipeline to the river, to do the whole project when the funding became available.
Knowing the lay of the land and where I lived downstream of where Pertwee Valley met the Missouri River, I was just in total shock. I had found the town of Lupus by canoe in 1977 and moved there shortly after, and loved being on the river. And the biggest, most recreationally used island in the river was just upstream of Lupus and immediately below where the pipeline would have entered the river. So that's what sent me into action.
You were a strong defender of the pipeline initially. So what about the potentially adverse effects cited by Doug Ely with regard to the recreational activities on the island just downstream from the proposed pipeline discharge?
That was one of the many things that we disagreed on at the beginning. I still believe that the fears were overblown about that, because the pipeline discharge into the Missouri River most of the year would be a lot better quality water than was in there. It's just a simple fact.
As I went to town and began to speak up about what are we going to do about this, and went to the Sierra Club, and there's where I met Hank Ottinger. Somebody handed me an article from I think Harold Smith magazine, but about John Todd in Massachusetts using wetlands for wastewater treatment. And I dove into that, and then his company and Susan Peterson started writing me letters, and I began to fill that briefcase with articles and learn much more about wetland wastewater treatment. And there, in the same week that we had this horrendous problem and potential dumping into the river headed our way, I found what I felt could be a solution. Using wetlands is more like a tertiary treatment. You still have your primary and your secondary treatment plant, but then that water is more finely tuned and sent through a gazillion microbes living on the cattails to further break down and improve the water quality. And that just sounded like the obvious way to go.
In March of '89, in Time magazine, they had about a 5-column piece on 2 professors at Humboldt State. And they were facing a similar problem in the town of Arcata. But this was a remarkable little piece, and it pointed out that our idea, Doug's idea, was not at all novel, was not at all revolutionary. That in point of fact, it had been done.
And so if you were looking at trying to take care of this over a 20-year period, you don't have to do too much to the concrete pipe, but you sure have to take care of the wetlands. And so I was looking at constructability and cost, long-term cost. And those were the 2 things that I felt were the considerations that, as the Director of Public Works, I had an obligation to express to the City Council and City Manager.
I'm wondering if you could give me your first impressions of Doug Ely and perhaps Hank Ottinger. Doug was a wild hippie at that time. And did you meet them for the first time at a city council meeting?
Actually, I knew Hank Ottinger from some other work on the council and other things in the community. And I briefly knew about Mr. Ely, but I must say they did present quite an interesting pair when they first appeared before the city council, and asked the council actually to stop and take a look to see if there were alternatives. And yes, it was like, where did these 2 wild and crazy guys come from? How dare they come in and interrupt, a renowned engineering firm who had the answers?
Well, the city manager said, thanks for being here, but it's a little bit late for any of these alternatives, and they voted 6-1 to proceed with the pipeline. And so that was quite a shock and a low point in the year-long battle.
Really testified on a quality of life by the riverside, being affected by all that affluent floating downstream. That didn't stop voting 6-1 to go for available federal funds. They might lose if they decided to wait and see. Now Columbia's got a sewer to the ocean full of do-do-do-do-do-do-do.
How did it feel to be the lone dissenter?
Lonely. It also presented in an interesting holiday time because that was the last council meeting of the year and then not coming back until after the new year. So out and about during that particular holiday season, one of the things that struck me was the number of people who approached me. And the topic of conversation quickly became, why are we not looking at other alternatives? Can there be a better way to handle the future needs of wastewater treatment for the city of Columbia? And maybe the suggestion made by these two wild and crazy guys wasn't so wild and crazy after all.
Now Doug and Hank started to play hardball.
We went back to the city council and said, you know, you all have failed to comply with Clean Water Act. We will, unless you seek an extension to meet that requirement, look into the alternatives. A 90-day extension, we will go to the Clean Water Commission and ask that they comply with the law and rescind the funds that they had promised in this project. And that got their attention big time.
The council at the time obviously had to defer to our experts on the city staff and our engineers to say, have we dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's? Because we are very heavily dependent on some of this funding to make this happen.
Well, it looks like on January 11th, they did make that recommendation, and the Clean Water Commission gave you a 90-day extension.
Yes.
Despite the City Council's openness to exploring the possibility of a wetland system, and even soliciting proposals for such a system, prospects for approval of this alternative seemed unlikely, to say the least. At a meeting in late January of 1989, officials of the Department of Natural Resources virtually ruled out a full-scale wetland system. In fact, at this time, no agency that would have to approve a wetland system made any commitment. This setback only spurred more action by a coalition of organizations and individuals who had been inspired by Doug and Hank's dream of a wetland system.
In part, I think some of what motivated it was a kind of theater of the absurd, and that was encapsulated by Doug's brilliant notion of the acronym CRAP, Citizens Resolved Against the Pipe. And I think that brought a lot of people in who ordinarily might not be all that interested in, wastewater? And so there was that. There were certainly the membership of the Sierra Club of the local group became enthused about it. Audubon, when it became clear that the Missouri Department of Conservation was looking for land to reclaim for flyway, the Audubon Society obviously got on board. A little later in the process, Ducks Unlimited, understandably, became interested. And Audubon and Ducks Unlimited aren't always on the same page, but in this case, each group's needs were being met, let's say. Not the least important part of this, of course, were the media, and in this case, most notably the Columbia Tribune, John Schneller, who was managing editor, I believe, at that time, and one of his ace reporters, you could say, Tracy Barnett. And they kept this story on the front page of the paper. As I reflect on it, it seemed like almost every day there was another story about how this whole issue was progressing. And so that generated more and more public interest.
Members of CRAP were far from the only citizens supporting a wetland system. Mary Ann McCollum filed to run for mayor in January, and her opposition to the pipeline was a major factor in her overwhelming victory in the April 4th election. While public support for a wetland system grew, city officials not only remained skeptical, but feared the loss of funding if plans for such a system didn't get approval from several state and federal agencies.
It was a difficult time for me because I'm sitting up there at a council meeting getting kind of lambasted, some people would say. He's opposed to all this. Well, I'm sitting there thinking, wait a minute, EPA says build that pipeline. we don't know what a wetland is, And here you have the water division of DNR saying, what are you talking about?
The legitimate concerns of the city manager were allayed somewhat by the approval of a so-called Memorandum of Understanding in May. Its main effect was to give the city adequate time to develop a suitable plan for a wetland system without fear of losing funding that was already in place for a pipeline. But later that month, the specter of contamination of city wells was raised by Dick Mallon, director of the Department of Water and Light.
In terms of the hydrology, when you're pulling water up through the wells, that creates a cone of influence and it starts pulling in groundwater into that. And of course, the groundwater involves the effluent from the treatment plants. There were extensive hydrological studies done at the onset of this whole project back in 89, 90, 91. And they all indicated that there would be minimal influence on the well fields by the effluent.
Tribune article on October 24th, where Mallon and Patterson came to you with diametrically opposed recommendations. So how did you handle that?
Not easily. It was tough. I had to take a report to the council, and at the council meeting, of course, department heads are there, just like I was for 25 years. And I'd expect them to, even, if they did or didn't agree, to give their opinion, and their best shot at it. And then I had to make a decision. And I don't mind telling you, I struggled over it for a while. I just came to the conclusion that we ought to try it.
But finally, regulatory agencies, the Missouri Department of Conservation, the City Council, and City Manager all agreed on the wetland system. On November 6 of 1989, the proposal for a direct pipeline from the sewage treatment plant to the Missouri River was abandoned for good.
All day, all night, Mayor Mary Ann said then and now, I think we can be more sensitive to the environment if we try. Well, the DNR and the conservation, much to Raybeck's consternation, bought time and land so this wetland project can fly. Now Columbia's got a newer sword in ocean, what to do about their do-do-do.
Now it was up to the citizens of Columbia, who were asked to vote yes for the wetlands and for an increase in their sewer rates to pay for it.
As for the strategy, we knew we had to have approval from the citizens of Columbia for a bond issue, and so putting together the campaign committee for that, people came forward and volunteered, which normally does not happen.
That's great.
And when the final results came in, it was absolutely phenomenal. I want to say close to 94% of the vote. No one could believe. I mean, it was like the citizens all saying, we're going to make this work.
How unlike much of the present-day political scene. Citizens voting to raise their own fees and a bipartisan approach to a complicated and controversial project.
This is probably one of the best examples where from even the most conservative Republicans were joining together to say to the most liberal of Democrats and others that let's work together on this and see if there cannot be another alternative. Columbia can do better than this.
Plans for Eagle Bluffs were made public in April of 1992, and construction of both projects was soon underway. But not so fast. Natural forces, rather than political ones, took a final shot at the completion of the wetland system and Eagle Bluffs.
But it goes back to something that really looks good, sounds good, and is good. Don't always think about how hard it is to build it. But when we talk about the things that could go wrong, we have the traditional hard parts of the dewatering of the pipeline, and then we get the flood in 1993. And that first flood, we were very vulnerable at that time. If anyone knows who was here, that entire bottom was underwater. I mean, they had $500,000 worth of equipment laying it, standing out there about 6 feet up on the water in it. And they got caught. They couldn't get out. And so we basically had to rebuild all of our everything we had done up to that point except for the pipeline.
So we anticipated opening to the public in the fall of '93. And then the flood came. And the flood, I think the flood crested toward the end of July at unseen river levels. And the damage to Eagle Bluffs, I think we estimated the damage to be something in the area of $2 million. And the development project itself to start with was about 5 or 6.
But finally, in the fall of 1995, Eagle Bluffs Conservation Area opened to the public. Before concluding with more footage of the fabulous wildlife at Eagle Bluffs, here are some comments by Lowell Patterson. An initial opponent of the wetland system, Lowell not only changed his mind, but saw the joint project with the Missouri Department of Conservation through to the end, thereby honoring the proposals of Doug Ely and his allies, citizens with the courage to confront a giant engineering firm and its supporters in City Hall.
It was a very, very unique situation, and time was right for it. And the proponents were very, very eloquent about it. And they portrayed a very, very attractive picture. And fortunately, that picture is what you got down. When it became apparent that, hey, this is not an acceptable solution. It may be the best, but it's not acceptable. And you started talking to each other instead of arguing with each other. We started becoming, like that song, coming to the middle. And we got to where we were able to communicate, even though we were still disagreeing. I think when you weigh it out as to what it was as far as personal trials versus what the even personal growth and personal experiences were, let alone the results of the field, the project was one of the things I'm going to be most proud of.
When I order out now to quench my thirst, it's Lowell's water I ask for first, straight from the faucet. No bottled water, please. I drain my glass with civic pride and a toast to those who've always tried to do more than just what you need to get by. Because Columbia's got a newer sword and ocean of what to do about their do-do-do-do.
in the ever after? Can we make you feel it in your bones? Daughter of the rain, sister river otter, dancing in the flames, breathing in the water.